Hello, everyone. We are just about to get started. So there's a few seconds left before we get started. So I'll start here in 15 seconds. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Friday session of Business Intelligence Tips with Rich Bendickson. Today, we're going to be talking about querying SQL Server data in Excel with a parameter. I started this topic a couple of weeks ago, and I had planned on talking a little bit more focused today on parameters and querying and connecting up Excel. And the more I got into it, the more I found that I'm going to lose some of my beginner students with how to do that. So I'm going to take it a little bit slow and just take piece by piece here as I hook them up. Now, I used to do this all the time in older Excel, and it was actually much easier, I thought, than with the newer versions of Excel. But today I'm going to go off of Office 365 and go through a few things that I find are helpful when querying data out of SQL Server Direct into Excel and what I do to do that. Now, how I do it today is very different than how I did it previously, and so that's where I was finding that some of the differences, and many of those are for good reasons that you'll see here shortly. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is your Excel might not look exactly like this here, in that I'm going to be doing um, some things around going through the data here in um, 365. But one of the things that I use a lot is this developer tab that's up here. Now, by default, this typically doesn't show up. The reason that I turn this on a lot is whenever I get stuck or not really sure how to do things or what's going on, I'll record a macro of that. And then I can see behind the scenes what it's doing there. And that's how I automate a lot of things. So that's just one thing that I use for that. The other thing is for some visual aspects. So for instance, one of the things that I wanted to show you today was oftentimes I want to create a report that maybe isn't a listing of something where I'll query the database and bring in data. And so there's a lot of developer features to that I'll get into. But what I'm going to start out with is just going to my data tab. We're going to get data from SQL Server. And I did some of this in the last session. And when I say get data from SQL Server, it's going to ask me for the server. I'll put my laptop in here, the database. Now, if I did nothing more than just kind of said, okay, it's going to prompt me for that. But what I prefer to do, and I mentioned this last time, is to use a SQL statement to do this. So if at all possible, and you have a tool that you can test SQL statements out, it's far easier, I find, if you know what that SQL statement is ahead of time. So I'm just going to type in a basic one here from our data mart. We have a table called account unit structure, which gives you a listing of account units out of the Infor system. So those of you that are familiar with Infor would be familiar with this. And I'll say, okay. Now, what that's going to do is it's going to launch this inside what a tool called Power Query that's part of the SQL system. Now, I used to do that, and it would create a query behind the scenes in a macro, and I could override things. But we're going to be doing this in a little more current version. So I'm going to take it a little bit slow. We're going to do the first part today where I'm just going to say create that query. I'm going to say load to, and what that's going to do is allow me to say, where do I want to put the results of that query? And I'm going to say right into my worksheet. And instead of saying cell A1, I'm going to move that down and say maybe B5. So I give myself a little more room to work with. So what that does is it runs that query and puts it, the results, in a B5. And as you can see here, it's got all my companies and account units and so forth. Now, what I often want to do is take and make this more of a report where I could say something like account unit listing. I could give it a title up there. I could put a parameter on here where I could say I want this to be company equals 1, something like that. And excuse me, that would make that where I could then ultimately want to connect this up and be able to change that and drive this down here. And that's where, as I got into it, there ended up being many pieces to that puzzle that you would need to understand. So before I hook all of that together, what I want to do is start going through some basic pieces with you. And the first piece I want to do is, I mentioned I want to take this cell and pass it as a parameter to here to filter that down. Well, to do that, we have to do a couple things. The first thing what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here on my query and I'm going to edit this query. Now, what that's going to do is open it up into the Power Query Editor. Now, to pass that cell reference in here is quite a few steps. It used to be much simpler, but now because of the power of Power Query, it's become a little more complicated. So what I'm going to do is first just talk a little bit about parameters. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a parameter here. And you can do that a lot of different ways, but I like to just say new parameter, give it a name. So I'll call this company. And then on this company parameter, I can say what data type it is, and you want to try and match this to your value. So in this case, it's a number, and I can set a value. Maybe I'll set it to be 2. Say okay. Now, right now, that's just a parameter. That's a value of 2, and I have my source query. They're not really connected in any way at this point. So how I connect them up is I would want to filter that data. So I can go to the column that I want to filter by, so company in this case, and I'm going to do a number filter. And on my number filter, I'm going to say I want that column to be equal to, and I can put in a formula here, but instead of a specific value, I'm going to do this little drop down here and say I want to do that as a value of parameter, and my parameter, I pick company because it's the only one I have, but it's just company. Now when I say okay, it filters the data for that. So if I come back here and say parameter value is 3, go back to my query, my filter is 3. So that's now what I want to return. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say close and load that data back here. And now it reran that data and loaded it back up with company 3. So what I've done is I've created a query, I created a parameter, and then I linked that parameter to a filter that was in there. What we're going to do in the next session, next time, is I'm going to show you how you would take and link this cell to drive the parameter, which would drive the query, so that we then would have a report that we can modify things as we go. So as of right now, if I do want to edit that query, I got to come over here and edit it this way, kind of the way that I showed you. I'll go back to 1, close and load. Now we'll come back here, and that will, we'll refresh that data that way, and it ran it there. So it's a couple step process where I'm editing the parameter value over in Power Query. But next week, we're going to get through how do I take and change the value here and have it drive the query parameter value there. Hopefully you found today's session at least a little bit helpful on the start of the journey of parameterizing things that way. As you can see, we're going to build out a report with parameters, and we'll start to add more and more advanced features as we go. As you get into it, as always, if you do have any suggestions, please feel free to email us at dashboardgear.com, and we'll be continuing your business intelligence journey. Until next week, thank you for joining again.